morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Chantal Ononaiwu, President of the International Law Association Caribbean Branch. It's truly a pleasure to welcome you to the conference of the ILA Caribbean Branch. The International Law Association, which was founded in 1873, is a nonprofit organization devoted to the study, clarification, and development of international law, and furthering international understanding and respect for international law. The Caribbean branch of the ILA, which was established in 2014, brings together persons with an interest in promoting the development and understanding of international law in the Caribbean. The branch undertakes outreach activities, such as our conference, and our members participate in the ILA's committees and study groups, which research and report on areas of international law in either public, private, or commercial law. This year, the theme of the branch's conference is Justice and Resilience for the Caribbean. What role for international law? Building resilience is a matter of survival for the Caribbean. A prosperous future requires improved resilience to shocks like climate change or natural disasters. It also requires healthy populations and resilient health systems. A more resilient future for the region requires recognition that the Caribbean is disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change, but bears extremely low responsibility for the emissions that cause climate change. Securing resilience for the region also demands increasing levels of sustainable investment. Our conference will be examining the prospects and limits of international law in securing justice and resilience for the Caribbean. These questions will be explored by panels on sustainable investing, health resilience, and climate justice. We're excited to be exploring these issues when so many critical developments are unfolding. International legal developments pertaining to climate change, debates taking place in many of our countries about mandatory COVID-19 vaccination and PCR testing, and dialogues about how to address the financing gap for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. We're extremely honored to have such a dynamic group of speakers to examine these issues. Our speakers hail from diverse backgrounds: academia, legal practice, investment banking, development finance, diplomacy, and international negotiations. And they will be bringing their collective expertise to bear on the discussion of these issues. We look forward to a stimulating exchange of perspectives involving not only our speakers, but also our audience through the comments and questions you pose. And we also invite you, as I see some have already been doing, to use our conference's virtual lobby to network and connect. We're pleased to kick off our conference proceedings with a keynote address, and I will now turn over to our Honorary Secretary, Justice Anthony Gafoor, to introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Rolande Pryce. Anthony?
Thank you very much, Madam President, Chantal, and of course, I also would like to endorse all that has been said and to formally welcome everyone to our conference, which of course we look forward to your enthusiastic participation. So it's very much my pleasure and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, Ms. Rolande Pryce. And I'll just share a few thoughts and words with you. Ms. Pryce is the World Bank Country Manager for Rwanda. She oversees the bank's fairly significant $2.3 billion program in Rwanda, US dollar program, and leads the policy dialogue with government counterparts, private sector, civil society, and other development partners. Prior to this assignment as operations manager covering Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Rolande was responsible for strategy formulation, quality of the US $5.5 billion lending portfolio, development partner coordination and administration of one of the largest World Bank offices globally. Her career at the World Bank spans some 15 years, and in that time, she has served in 4 of the World Bank's 6 regions: Africa, East Asia, Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean and South Asia. She has also moved between multiple departments and which has varied between the legal vice presidency, the energy global practice, and many country management units. She's not new to the African region, having been responsible for operational quality and portfolio management for the bank's Africa energy portfolio and the Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi country teams between 2012 and 2014. She has deep experience managing country programs, including those of Sri Lanka and the Maldives, Indonesia, and the Eastern Caribbean. She joined the bank in 2006 as counsel in the legal vice presidency, representing the bank in operations in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific Islands, and providing legal advisory support in finance, infrastructure, and the private sector. Before joining the World Bank between 1995 to 2006, Rolande has worked in various capacities as legal advisor to the Jamaican government on public international law and international trade issues. She was employed with the Fair Trading Commission, the Anti-Dumping and Subsidies Commission, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, and the Attorney General's Chambers. She has also served as an adjunct lecturer at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. Her formal qualifications include a Master's in Public International Law from the University College London, a Juris Doctor from the University of Miami, and a Bachelor of Science in International Business and Mathematics from the City University of New York. And so without further ado, it is indeed my pleasure to invite Ms. Pryce to give the feature address.
Mr. Justice Anthony, thank you so much and good morning. They should have told you that you could have done an abbreviated version of that opening. I'm really, really pleased to be here and would like to say good morning to all of the participants. Indulge me for a moment as I thank the executive of the Caribbean branch of the International Law Association, led by my dear friend and colleague Chantal, for this invitation. For over a decade, she has brought me back, after over a decade, she has brought me back to public international law, and it has been almost as long that I have not fully immersed myself in Caribbean issues. So this is a homecoming of sorts for me, and I'm really greatly appreciative. The climate and health crises of today reflect dire global challenges that necessitate a global response. How international law can be utilized to secure justice and support resilience for the Caribbean in the face of these challenges is the subject of this conference and the topic on which I have been asked to share my perspective. I would like to emphasize that the views I express are my own and do not in any way reflect the views of the staff, management, or executive board of the World Bank. So let me get to the matter at hand. Climate justice and health resilience for the Caribbean. COVID-19, a zoonotic disease, and climate change have starkly exposed the interdependence between people, the planet, and the economy. The consequences of natural capital degradation and pandemics are severe and often irreversible. Developing countries bear the brunt of the impacts due to both geography and their greater economic dependence on natural resources. In Caribbean countries, some of the smallest of developing countries, the impacts can be most acute. The Caribbean islands are still under assault from COVID-19, even as they try to protect their communities from rising seas and raging storms. This past August, Haiti suffered a 7.2 magnitude earthquake and Tropical Storm Grace days later, all the while attempting to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Prime Minister Philip Joseph Pierre of St. Lucia captured it well in his speech at the UN General Assembly this year, when he said, "We are now being inundated by the new, while still being overwhelmed by the old." But can these dire challenges be tackled as a practical matter under international law? I would say yes. Treaties and agreements can work. A highly relevant example is the success of the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. It is one of the most effective environmental treaties ever negotiated and implemented. On the basis of science and driven by collective interest, it aimed to ban the global production and use of ozone-damaging chemicals such as chlorofluorocarbons. To date, it is the only United Nations environmental agreement to be ratified by every country in the world. And it's interesting to note that that Montreal Protocol has an amendment called the Kigali Amendment. And I'm coming to you from Kigali. And the anniversary of the Kigali Amendment was actually yesterday. So it kind of made me smile because my two worlds were coming together. 3 decades after this ratification, the ozone layer has shown signs of improvement. With the parties to the protocol having phased out 98% of their ozone depleting substances, they saved an estimated 2 million people from skin cancer every year. But I suggest to you that it will be complicated to get the same result from the international climate change agreements. While similar to the ozone problem, climate change has important differences. It is multifaceted and inherently tied to the economy. Greenhouse gases are prevalent in transport, manufacturing, energy, agriculture, and infrastructure. Fixing climate change will require a complete transformation of all the levers of the economy. Fixing the ozone layer does not. The Montreal Protocol's limited number of chemicals were far easier to manage. Causation of ozone depletion very, very clearly identified and with direct and immediate human health impacts. A thinner ozone layer could lead to skin cancer and cataracts. This got our attention, much in the way that the immediate and devastating health crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic got our attention. But the impact of climate change feels less proximate, less immediate, and far more indirect in comparison. While addressing climate change is understandably a more complex undertaking, thankfully we do have international law tools already in place. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change constitutes the foundational climate agreement and establishes key principles: that climate change is a serious problem, that action cannot wait upon the resolution of scientific uncertainties, that developed countries should take the lead, and that they should compensate developing countries for any additional costs incurred in taking measures under the convention. The UNFCCC endorses the concept of common but differentiated responsibility in the climate context, which is highly relevant for the Caribbean. The convention sets a framework that encourages transparency, providing information that helps to level the playing field in associated negotiations and deal-making. And it addresses upfront the asymmetry in the cause of the climate crisis and in the resources available for dealing with it. But the convention lacks binding policy commitments. Thus, in my view, the UNFCCC provides a good example of the benefits and constraints of international law. The benefits, permitting the Caribbean and other less powerful states to participate in agenda setting, to help define key principles and the rules of engagement. The constraint, the lack of binding policy commitments. There is no need for me to elaborate on some of the inherent weaknesses in public international law to this audience. So I will just say the following list: non-compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice and other key decision-making bodies, the uncertainty or vagueness of rules, weak sanctions, and where a state or individual is deemed deserving of a remedy, the inability to effectively enforce the same. I recall during my time at Jamaica's Anti-Dumping and Subsidies Commission, when we finally completed a case and found a large country in breach of our national anti-dumping legislation, we then realized how difficult it would be to actually implement a remedy against that country. It felt very much like these carefully crafted trade rules were relevant for large economy trading partners, but were not well suited to circumstances where there was such a disparity in size and in volume of trade between countries. My experience suggests that while international law can help us to navigate complex and unequal power relations, it is not the whole solution. Let's go back to the Montreal Protocol. Another important lesson there is that it was not solely attributable, the success was not solely attributable to the implementation of the treaty, but was accompanied by global partnership, broad stakeholder involvement, and strong political will. Applying these lessons leads me to the conclusion that collective action, mutualizing responsibilities and response, will be essential to achieving justice and resilience for the Caribbean. The handling of the COVID-19 pandemic by some actors offers valuable lessons on collective action. Despite deplorable displays of nationalism, paternalism, geopolitical jousting, and mismanagement at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, through the development and deployment of the vaccines, and even today, there are still a number of good examples from which to draw lessons to help us build greater resilience for the region. I want to tell you a little bit about the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust, or AVAT, which aims to secure vaccine doses to complement other vaccine procurement initiatives and to attain the immunization target of 60% of Africa's population. Partners in that initiative include the African Export-Import Bank, Afri-Exim Bank, it's called, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Africa CDC, and of course, my own institution, the World Bank. As vaccination is the panacea for economic recovery, African countries wanted to assure themselves that they could meet the herd immunity target. So they sought to procure the additional 400 million doses needed beyond the doses promised by the COVAX facility to achieve that threshold. The first step was securing financing. The chairman of the Afri-Exim Bank is quoted as saying, "Even today, you cannot talk to vaccine manufacturers without money behind you." This is a fact, and one which the World Bank knew when, as early as October 2020, it put in place facilities to ensure that countries would have the funds needed to procure vaccines. But not all countries armed with resources had the power and capacity to negotiate vaccine procurement deals. So the Afri-Exim Bank board raised capital and approved a $2 billion facility that made it possible for the AVAT to acquire 400 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccines. The AVAT team created a structure for pooled procurements, negotiated with Johnson & Johnson, and made a down payment in order to secure the needed volumes. Thereafter, individual countries were encouraged to sign contracts. They paid for vaccines more often than not with World Bank resources. It is worthy of note that many Caribbean countries benefited from vaccines obtained through the AVAT. So what are the key takeaways from the AVAT story that I'd like to highlight? First, you have to know where you want to go. You have to define targets early. The African Union did so for the African member states. The second is that you have to build a capable team. You must ensure you have the right skills on your side. It struck me that, in between the politicians, the heads of multilateral agencies, etc., the AVAT task team had a billionaire and philanthropist, an African billionaire and philanthropist, who led the negotiations with the vaccine manufacturers. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to play in that field. The third takeaway is leverage existing information, initiatives, and institutions. There was COVAX, that was useful, but it was not enough. Being able to leverage existing institutions is usually far more efficient than starting afresh and very much needed when time is of essence. The AVAT story gives me, actually quite a number of lessons, and permit me to digress a bit because I'd like to underscore the point of countries knowing where they want to go. Sub-Saharan Africa has gone beyond simply procuring vaccines in bulk through a homegrown solution. Learning lessons from this COVID-19 crisis and defining a path to improve health resilience, they have set about establishing pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities in Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Rwanda. Africa imports 99% of life-saving vaccines. This focus that they have brought to this problem demonstrates, again, international law and collective action in action. African states will leverage the recently concluded African Continental Free Trade Agreement that will help address market fragmentation and help to create robust supply chains. They can move their product around the continent. The Afri-Exim Bank will finance guarantees for the payments of licenses and royalties by these new pharmaceutical manufacturing companies on the continent. If you've been following the robust discussions around boosting the production of vaccines, you may not be sure whether intellectual property law is actually helping to facilitate technology transfer in the case of public goods like these. Would waiving patents be enough? What about sharing the manufacturing processes? How would quality be assured? There is talk of governments imposing compulsory licenses on vaccine manufacturers, compelling them to share know-how and oversee production processes. But those companies would also have to be compensated. This is still a ripe discussion. The WTO is one venue for those discussions. But in that consensus-based institution, the timeline for action is uncertain, to say the least. Thus, jumping back to the COVID-19 experience, I would say that, like the Montreal Protocol, they speak to the importance of working in harmony with others and having the courage and patience to stay the course together, even in the face of seemingly daunting odds. Collective action is a good way to resolve global problems and achieve global self-interest. But beyond international law and collective action, what else? Achieving climate justice and health resilience will require significant financial resources. The first step in forming the AVAT was raising the $2 billion needed to guarantee the payment for vaccines. And we know that the upfront costs of investing in modern, climate-smart technologies are often higher than outdated, polluting alternatives. For resource-constrained, middle-income countries, like the Caribbean countries, with high debts aggravated by COVID-19 and the associated recession, liquidity barriers will emerge. We know that COVID and climate response in many Caribbean countries has been muted through lack of resources. Concessional finance has played a key role in supporting climate-smart investments and in strengthening health systems, and in fact, multinational financial institutions have played and are also playing an important role in this regard. Since March 2020 to June 2021, the World Bank Group has offered $157 billion in financing to address COVID-19. This is more than we have in decades because of the need for a sustained and strong financial response. Through sustainable investments, then, the Caribbean can attract the resources that it will need to address these twin crises and put itself on a path to sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. Many developed countries and concerned citizens advocate strongly for low and middle income countries to integrate climate considerations into their development strategies. This is all the rage. Multilateral financial institutions are strongly encouraged, in fact, by some stakeholders, pressured to ensure that increasingly larger proportions of their concessional resources are directly supporting climate-sensitive engagements. Private investors, another source of financing, also have an increasing appetite for sustainable investments, which offer both measurable impacts on environment and society, as well as appropriate financial returns. It is therefore in the interest of low and middle income countries like those of the Caribbean to be part of the sustainable, resilient, and inclusive agenda. As developed countries pivot towards more climate-sensitive policies, developing countries should proactively participate in this transition. Failure to do so may bring risks of being left with stranded assets and shrinking markets for environmentally damaging commodities and production processes, and could prevent the Caribbean from tapping into much needed and significant private sources of capital for development. A fundamental shift in thinking and approach is needed at home. Too often now, Caribbean governments are in the news for implementing decisions that could threaten the environment. This bad press in the current context does not augur well for Caribbean states positioning themselves to be the beneficiaries of sustainable investments to which concessional resources are increasingly being targeted. And I say that for emphasis. It will become more and more difficult to advocate against developed countries taking action to harm the environment when the most affected are acting with nonchalance. The Caribbean stands to lose its moral high ground if it doesn't do things differently. Instead, I propose that as a region, the Caribbean could use the twin crises of COVID-19 and climate change to reset its development paradigm, to adopt a development path that promotes economic growth through a post-COVID recovery that is inclusive and consistent with environmental and social sustainability. This approach should maintain a clear line of sight to long-term development goals, recognize interconnections between people, the planet, and the economy, and tackle the increasing risk of shocks more efficiently. In rebranding itself deliberately and comprehensively, the region should consistently reflect this new regional paradigm in national development strategies, carrying it through to policies, legal and regulatory frameworks, and public investment decisions. This would place the Caribbean at the head of the curve, making it a magnet for sustainable investment. Think about it. Everybody wants to back a winner. The upside for us is huge. But I've spoken long enough. I wish to sum up by saying that the twin crises of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic have created an opportunity to do things differently and better, to set a path towards sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development, one that recognizes interconnections between people, the planet, and the economy. International law has successfully helped the Caribbean set agendas and define the rules of the game. But it is not the holy grail. Collective action, coupled with sustainable investment, are indispensable to support the achievement of justice and resilience in the Caribbean. Each of us here can and should contribute. Many of us have great influence. We take for granted that we shape minds, that we help to effectively position governments and businesses. Let us leverage this influence. Let us get to work. There is no time like the present.
Thank you very much, Ms. Price, for a stimulating and indeed very topical presentation, which has helpfully linked the three main panels that are about to start. The first one being on, of course, sustainable investing, but in particular touching on the other key themes that are going to be looked at by the various panels, also health resilience and climate justice. You focus very much on the importance of the role of international law, and sometimes people question the effectiveness of international law, but you have very helpfully illustrated, if I may say so, the significance of international law and collective action, and particularly what small developing states within the Caribbean can do to be ahead of the curve, as you so eloquently put it. So it has been a tremendously wonderful and enlightening presentation, which I think has very much helped to set the tone for today's conference. So on behalf of the ILA Caribbean Branch, I'd like to thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And of course, I can invite others who are present to show your appreciation, perhaps maybe not in the traditional way, but I suppose the way that we're now used to by Zoom. So this now takes us to the first panel, which will commence at 9:45 on sustainable investing. Thank you.